which meant my dad would never be executed. I can't tell you the relief there was to know that I was never going to have to witness, my dad be executed. I didn't want to go through it. I didn't want him to go through it. But on the charge of life, of murder, they gave him life in prison, which basically meant they were releasing him. And so we were excited. I know it sounds strange, but my dad was found guilty of murder. It means he was coming home. Because if you don't know, folks that have a family member in prison, we're stuck. It's like all we can think about is how do we get that family member out? And once they're coming home, it's like we're finally out of the system. So that night after the trial, Meryl and I went to visit with my dad. And it's my dad and us and his attorney. And my dad is so excited. He is leaving prison. He's going to be out in 3 days. And I'm a list maker. I make lists, and I'm very organized. And Marilyn had a lot of notes. And I had some questions, not about my dad, but about my mom and some things that came up in the courtroom. So Meryl and I are meeting with my dad, and my dad was always, Jim, ask anything. And I get to this one question, and he looks at me, and he says, Jim, I did it, and she deserved it. He confessed. I will tell you, first of all, I felt like an idiot that I had testified for him. I thought he was innocent. Even my mother's mother was testifying that she didn't think he was guilty. She thought he was innocent. So our entire family didn't think he did it. Here was the worst part. He blamed it on my mother. She deserved it. And my dad felt like he was the victim because he was in prison. And I quickly reminded him, no, the victim is the person that's buried. My mom, who you killed, is the victim. But that's not how he thought. And so I left that day. Meryl and I quickly decided to protest his parole. We reached out to a lot of people, my dad's parents, my dad's brother, my two brothers, my mom's side of the family. We all wrote letters of protest, and we had the parole board re-vote, and they denied his parole. And I said, I'm going to go tell my dad the great news. So I headed back to the jail, and I looked at my dad, and I said, you know what? We have turned on you. And please hear me. He was a big part of our lives. I would write him. I would visit him. I'd put money on his account. He was a big part of our life. I love my dad. And so for us to turn on him was a big deal. And I looked at my dad, and I said, I don't want to ever see you again. You will never see us again. Goodbye. And I was kind of excited. I said, Dad, you're not going back to death row. Death row is safe. You're isolated. You're going back to a maximum security general population prison. I said, good luck. You'll never see me again. And one of the really more traumatic things for us is we had found out that my dad, through that second trial, he not only hired those two men to kill my mom, he hired them to kill his 3 kids. I was supposed to be murdered. I was 12. My youngest brother, middle brother, was 10. Lewis was 9. Who kills their 3 kids? My dad is who kills their kids. And so it was very, I guess the best word to describe it is a betrayal. I felt so betrayed. I couldn't believe that he wanted to kill me. And so I wanted nothing to do with him. So off he goes back to prison. We had checked him off, and Meryl and I had Bryce. We were members at Fielder. We had just joined. I think we'd been there a year. And I'm looking at my son, who is 31. I know I do not look old enough to have a 31-year-old son, but we started early. But anyway, I'm looking at my son, Bryce. I'm like, could I kill him? I mean, I love this little boy. And here's the struggle I had. I look like my dad. I sound like my dad. I have a lot of the same mannerisms as him. We have the same name. I'm a lot like him. It is incredible the influence that especially dads and sons have on us. And it bothered me, just to put it lightly. And so 3 years went by, and I said, I've got to go see my dad because I need to figure out how did he go from a happily married man who at one time had an awesome wife and 3 kids, leaders in the church, to a killer. And not just a killer of his wife, but a killer of his whole family. How does that happen? And just to be honest, I struggled with that. And so I decided to go see him. And so I always share this. I grew up on death row. So every time I visited my dad, there was a big, thick piece of glass, and he had a telephone, and I had a telephone. I had not physically touched my dad since I was 13. And so at this time, I was 26, and I walk into the visitation room, and there's no glass because he's in general population. It's a contact visit. So he stands up. He wants to hug me. Are you kidding me? You know, I'm not touching you. And he thought it was the picture of, you know, the father and the son reuniting, right? And that was not what this picture was. This picture was I was disturbed and I needed answers. And I wouldn't hug, I wouldn't touch him. And I said, Dad, I'm not here to, reconcile. I need to know, how did you go from a happily married guy to a killer? Because unfortunately, I'm just like you, and I hate it. I hate it. First thing he said to me, he said, Jim, I'm sorry for what I did to you and your mom and your brothers. And it shocked me because I was one of those guys who, and I think a lot of us men struggle with this, that a lot of us men, especially my dad, he always thought he was right. It's kind of like we have the right to always be right. I'm sure I'm not the only man here. Okay, thank you. We always think we're right. And so here's what happens. If you have that attitude, you never apologize. And if you do, you're doing it to manipulate, right? You didn't really mean it because you're always right. And so when my dad said he was sorry, I had never, ever heard him say that, ever, because he never was. And what I've learned now, when you tell somebody you're sorry, the other person starts healing many times. And I didn't want any part of that. And so I said, Dad, great. And then he said, look, I need to explain something. He said, Jim, I've not had a visit, a phone call, money on my account in 3 years. Everybody deserted me. And I'm thinking, good. and what he said, he goes, look, I'm just trying to explain something. He said, I finally hit rock bottom in my life, and I've asked Christ into my life, and I've changed. I'm a Christian. And look, I'll be honest. I've seen a lot of men in prison. They come into prison. They say they find God. They head out the door. They toss their Bible in the trash can, and guess what? They come back later, 6 months. They're the same sorry dog they were the first time, you know? And so I wasn't believing my dad's jailhouse conversion. I'm just being honest. I wasn't believing it. And I said, Dad, I don't care. How did you go from a happily married guy to a killer? Here's his story. My dad said, he goes, Jim, I started making some bad choices. He said, I started going to happy hours right after work. And please hear me, I'm not saying it's wrong, just my opinion, to go have a beverage with some friends right after work. But you know what? If you're a husband and a dad, you go home. Husbands and dads go home. It's only supposed to be 1 hour. No, my dad, he would stay out till 2 in the morning. So here my mom has worked all day, fed us dinner, helped us with our homework, put us to bed, and my dad comes rolling in at 2 in the morning. And you know what? She's mad. Why? She should be. Husbands and dads come home, right? This went on. The next step, next bad choice, he started cheating on my mom. He started sleeping with a lady he worked with, and my mom caught him. And in my opinion, my mom did the right thing. She said, you know what? We're leaders in the church. We've got 3 boys. Let's get some counseling. Let's save our marriage and save our family. She gave my dad a second chance. My opinion, that was the right thing. But what does my dad do? Keeps going to the bars, keeps drinking, keeps cheating on my mom, keeps coming home late. One morning, he arrives, and my mom's mad. Again, she should be mad. And they get in an argument, and my dad makes the next bad choice. He punched my mom in the face. He punched my mom in the face. My mom, in my opinion, did the right thing. She left him. She said, I put up with you drinking, spending all our money. I put up with you cheating. I put up with you never coming home. I'm not putting up with you hitting me. She filed for divorce. My opinion, that is called a consequence. You hit a lady, you use the right to be married to her. My opinion. She files for divorce. He is furious. He can't believe that she would leave him. And so I'm looking at my dad and I'm like, wait a minute. You never come home, you drink all the time, you cheat on her, you hit her, and you can't figure out why she wants to leave you? What a great catch you are, right? I'm like, seriously? But that's his attitude. A lot of men have that attitude. And my mom did the right thing. She left. But he was upset about having to go through a divorce. He fought for custody, not because he wanted us. He was one of these men that didn't like to lose. And he certainly wasn't going to lose to a lady. It's just stupid. But that was his attitude. And so the Bible reminds us, and Marilyn used to say this a lot, and Luke, you probably have heard this as well. It says, bad company corrupts good character. Who you hang out with is who you become. And Bryce used to hate that because he knew it was true, right? There was something about helping your kids hang out with the right people. And bad company corrupts good character. And my dad was hanging out in this bar with some men he shouldn't be with. And you know, when you're really angry, be careful what you say, because a lot of times that becomes a life of its own. And he's in this bar with these two men, and he says, I sure wish she was dead. Next bad choice, how much would that cost me? And then he got this brilliant plan. He wanted to be rich, free, and single. So he takes out a bunch of life insurance on a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old and a 9-year-old and his wife, and he hires these two men for $2,000 to kill all four of us. And boom, that was his last choice. And what I realized is you don't go from a happily married family man to a killer like that. And you know this and I know this, once you make a couple of bad choices, the next ones just keep getting easier. And so I had to learn that I can't do some of these early choices because I don't want to be just like him. And the Bible also tells us, if you remember the story of Joseph when he was thrown into slavery by his brothers in Genesis, it says, Joseph threw his arms around his brothers and wept, and they embraced, and they talked. So for the next year, after my dad shared this, I decided to go see him once a month. And for the next year, I went through a forgiveness process with my dad, because the Bible tells us to forgive. You know, it says forgive each other just as Christ God forgave you. And we went through the process of really restoring a father and son relationship. But please hear me. I forgave my dad not to let him off the hook, but to let me off the hook. Because everybody I know, and some of you may have been offended or hurt by somebody, but I work with a lot of crime victims, and if we don't forgive our offender, we become bitter, angry, depressed. And I didn't want my dad to control me like that. So I forgave my dad to let me off the hook, not to let him off the hook. The Bible, well, you also heard the Bible talks that we should forgive, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't forget. And so even though I did forgive my dad, I have forgiven my dad, but it doesn't mean there's not a consequence. I still protested his parole every time he came up for parole, because you know what, if you do things like that to my mom, her son is going to speak up for her. And I'm going to protest my dad's parole because you shouldn't do that. That is a consequence. You're going to spend your life in prison. But I still restored a relationship. And a lot of people get those two things confused. You can restore, but there's still some consequences. And so for the next year, I really went through the forgiveness process. Well, I got a phone call, And we had found out that my dad had a brain aneurysm, and we had to rush down to the prison quickly. But by the time we got there, he was brain dead. It was an aneurysm that popped in his brain. And we had to make the decision to pull my dad off life support. And you would have thought that would be an easy decision to pull the plug on the man who killed your mom and killed us, but he was my dad. I love my dad. And he died that night. Well, what happens if you die in prison, you either get buried on the prison grounds, or like normal people, you can claim the body and have a funeral someplace else. We were not going to have a legacy of having my dad being buried in a prison field. And so we claimed his body, had a private service in San Antonio, but we knew something was up. The warden and the chaplain from the prison were at the funeral in San Antonio. And the warden approached me afterwards and he said, "Jim, this has never happened in the history of the Texas prison system. We're going to allow a memorial service for your dad inside the prison, and we want you and your family to attend." And I always kid Marilyn, I take her to all the hot spots. So, honey, pack your things, we're going to death row, right? So we headed to Huntsville, and we walk into a chapel. After we had a tour, the warden gave us a tour. We got to see the darkness of death row, where my dad lived for so long, which is very disturbing. We then went to general population, where my dad was serving out his life sentence. And then we went into a chapel, kind of a room like this. And I sit down, Marilyn, my two brothers, our wives, and we're looking forward, but behind us, all behind us, are about 300 men in white prison uniforms. And I'll be honest, I was scared to death. I know I look tough, but I was scared to death. I'm hanging out with inmates in a prison. Who would have thought? And what the Bible tells us, He restores my soul and guides me in paths of righteousness, Psalms 23:3. And we got a picture of that. My dad had a job in prison. We didn't know it. He didn't tell us. He was the minister of music. He was restored in prison to start a prison choir. And so we're listening to the prison choir, which is pretty incredible. If you've never heard a bunch of men in prison sing Christian songs, it's pretty powerful. And then for the next, there was a microphone right here. For the next 3 hours, one by one, a man in a white prison uniform walked up, grabbed the microphone, looked me straight in the face and said, "I became a Christian because your dad shared Christ with me and it's changed my life." And we listened for 3 hours, one by one, 300 men talk about life change. That's what the gospel does. And at the end of it, the chaplain said, "Jim, would you like to say anything to these men?" And I was not prepared, and I didn't want to do it. You know, these men are checking out my cute wife. I just wanted to grab her and get out, right? But that's not what happened. So I walked up, I turned around, and I saw these 300 men in white prison uniforms. And the first thing I told them is, "Please don't judge me. I'm not judging you. The only difference between us is you made a bad choice that got you in prison." But what I've learned in prison is a lot of men have not forgiven themselves. And a lot of times if you don't forgive yourself, that guilt really turns into shame. and I just share with him, you don't have to let, and that's true with all of us in here, you don't have to let your worst bad choice define you. That does not have to be who you are. And we all have an opportunity to let go of that. And that's really what forgiveness is about. I'll describe it. My brothers had not forgiven my dad until they heard 300 men talk about him. You know, my dad would share his story. He'd meet a man in prison, and he'd share, "I did all these bad things. I'm now serving a life sentence, but I've asked God in my life. I've taken accountability and responsibility. I've asked God for forgiveness, and I'm going in a new direction." That was his story, and he shared that. And when my brothers heard that, they described it like this. A lot of times, and you may relate to this, if you've been hurt by somebody, you pick up a suitcase of hurt, anger, shame, betrayal, and you carry that stuff around. When you forgive the person, you get to let go of it. Doesn't mean that that stuff didn't happen, but it's not attached. You get to let go. It's freeing. And so we forgave my dad that day, and I really learned the issue of forgiveness. And I will share with you, some of you in this room may have gone through abuse from a parent or a spouse, and you may still be holding on to that. And I will tell you that if you will forgive that person, it is healing for you. Or you may be struggling that maybe you're the person that did something awful, and you need to go ask for forgiveness. It may even be somebody in this room needs to talk to somebody else in this room. But we should ask people to forgive us. And then lastly, forgive yourselves. I mean, the Bible does say, get rid of all bitterness, rage, every form of malice. If we confess our sins, he's faithful. He will forgive us and purify us. Go now and leave your life of sin. That's what the Bible says. And I'll end with this. I'm going to end with two things. We had a consequence for my dad. Marilyn is sweet, but she's also very tough. She said, you know what? Your dad does not get to see our son. My dad never met our son. And that was a consequence because my dad killed my son's grandmother. Bryce never got to meet my mom. And Marilyn said, you know what? Your dad is not going to have influence on our son. That is a consequence. And so Bryce never met his grandfather, my dad. Well, a few years ago, I was at an event. This is how God works things together. And it's a great example of that song we sang a while ago of how it may have been meant for evil, but God can use it for good. And I was at an event. Long story short, a person ended up at my table, coincidentally, randomly, if you believe those words. And he introduced himself, and I said, well, I'm Jim Buffington. And he said, well, that's funny. I knew a guy named James Buffington. And I said, well, my dad's name is James. No. That wasn't him. And I said, well, he goes, this guy was from San Antonio. And I said, well, I grew up in San Antonio. No. This guy was in prison. And I said, well, my dad was in prison. And he goes, what? He goes, do you have a brother named Oscar and Lewis? And I said, yes. And he looks at me. He goes, you're not going to believe this. I was your dad's cellmate before he passed away in prison. And I'm looking at him, and I shared, I'm kind of a crier, and I'm an ugly crier, and I was bawling, meeting my dad's inmate, who God placed him at my table. How that story ends, Ken is out of prison. He's been out of prison. He lives in Dallas. He now volunteers with Bridges to Life, and every Monday night, in a small group with 10 inmates, my son Bryce is with Ken, and Bryce gets to hear of how his grandfather changed. Because Ken said, I don't know who that man was that committed that crime, but he was a completely different person of the man I met in prison after he became a Christian. And that's what God can do. He can take evil and turn it for good. And he can do that in your life. If you've not experienced that, whether it's through forgiveness or whether it's through accepting a relationship with Jesus Christ. Forgiveness is healing. And it's incredible that Ken is such an important part of our life. In fact, Ken, my dad's cellie, that's a prison term if y'all don't know. Some of you will get that later. But I've got a picture of our son got married last year, right before COVID. It's great to sneak a large wedding in February before COVID. And I've got a picture of my dad's cellie with me and a picture of my dad. Is that incredible? I get to honor both my parents. I get to honor my dad, who changed, and I get to honor my mom. And I'll end it with this. My mom knew somebody was trying to kill her. She'd had no idea it was my dad. There had been a couple of attempts in her life. She had gone to the police. They didn't have a clue it was my dad. So she had already written her funeral service out in her safety deposit box. She had 3 little boys, and all she wanted sung was a song for us, just in case. And, for a lady to take the time to leave a message for her kids is pretty incredible. And I will not sing this to you. It's an old 70s song, but it says, I'll tell the world that I'm a Christian. I'm not ashamed his name to bear. I'll tell the world that I'm a Christian. I'll take him with me anywhere. I'll tell the world how Jesus saved me and how he gave me a life brand new. And I know that if you trust him, that all he gave me, he'll give to you. I'll tell the world that he's my Savior. No other one could love me so. My life, my all is his forever, and where he leads me, I will go. For when he comes and life is over, for those who love him, there's more to be. Eyes have never seen the wonders that he's preparing for you and me. Oh, tell the world that you're a Christian. Be not ashamed his name to bear. Oh, tell the world that you're a Christian and take him with you anywhere. And so I will tell you, we all have a story. I'm sharing my story. And you know what? My dad told his story in prison. My mom left me a commandment to go tell the world that you're a Christian. That is our role. The Bible says, go and tell. I will tell you, there is so much impact when you share your story with somebody and are very transparent and share your pain. It heals you, but it also helps the other person to maybe make a decision to change their life. And that's our opportunity today. Thank you so much for letting us be here, Mark. I appreciate it. Thank you.
I hope on your way out today you'll take a few minutes to stop by and see Jim and Marilyn at the table in the lobby.